Hello, and thank you for taking time away from your busy entry-level 3 to 5 years of experience required jobs and slaving away just to make ends meet for the boss to get fat and rich or perhaps your comfortable life as part of one of the better paid professions that manages to avoid discomfort, what Marxists call the labor aristocracy: doctors, lawyers, uh, supervisory workers who still use their labor themselves to listen to this little talk. Now, this is a big old piece that I'm doing here, and I may have to break it into some smaller videos later to go into greater detail. The topic today: what is leftism? Now, there are a variety of leftist views. In broad, the two main divisions of leftism are socialism or communism sometimes, but that's actually what we call communism is a sub-branch of leftism, and specifically within that is Marxism and utopian socialism. Within Marxism are the Marxist-Leninists, the democratic socialists who identify as Marxists. Not all democratic socialists do. Some fall under, more accurately, the utopian socialist or even anarchist traditions, making things even more confusing. But there are the socialists and the anarchists as the large branches. Now, I could just tell you what I think these things are or what I've come to understand, but it's helpful sometimes to hear a variety of views and hear people put it in their own words. Now, first of all, what is socialism? The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy has an excellent article on this. I highly recommend it. Just Google Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, socialism. It's a peer-reviewed academic resource, as it says. Some of its articles are good, some of them are bad, but it's an article on socialism, as opposed to liberalism, which is, ironically, you can tell, even though they both talk about capitalism and socialism, the one on socialism was written by people sympathetic to socialism, the one on liberalism was written by liberals, and they have contradictions because they're written by different people. Nonetheless, it's an excellent article. In short, socialism is both an economic system and an ideology. A socialist economy features social rather than private ownership of the means of production, or to be precise, either social or public ownership, which are different things. It also typically organizes economic activity through planning rather than market forces, typically because there is an entire subsection on market socialism in this article, and gears production towards need satisfaction rather than profit accumulation. Socialist ideology asserts moral and economic superiority of an economy with these features, especially as compared with capitalism. More specifically, socialists typically argue capitalism undermines democracy, facilitates exploitation, distributes opportunities and resources unfairly, and vitiates community, stunting self-realization and human development. Socialism, by democratizing, humanizing, and rationalizing economic relations, largely eliminates these problems. That's very broad and very accurate to socialism as a whole, instead of talking about specific sub-ideologies of socialism definition. Now, each ideology puts things in their own words. Actually, I have one here on my phone. It'd be probably easier to add this one to the list. Yeah, we'll get to that. So now the different branches are, as I said, anarchism and socialism. Before I go into the socialist ideologies, which are probably more varied, let me briefly mention anarcho-communism and anarchism that's non-communist exist as a subdivisions of the anarchist branch. Anarcho-communism, also known as anarchist communism, is the belief that hierarchies, money, and social classes should not exist, and the means of production is to be held in common by society. Anarcho-communists support direct democracy and a network of voluntary associations, workers' councils, decentralized economic planning, and a gift economy, in which everyone will be free to satisfy their needs. It mentions well-known anarcho-communist writers, the most famous of whom is Peter Kropotkin, who it mentions, and Nestor Makhno. I've heard of him, but the real Kropotkin is the really famous one. And if I remember correctly, he heavily influenced Mao. He went to China for a while. Some of his writings made their way to China, and Mao based some of his ideas on it, trying to integrate more traditional socialist views. Gives examples of anarcho-communism in practice. Now, the anarchist communism article is just going by a different name for it, also known as anarchist communism, as you see, and this is a much longer article, which I definitely don't have time to go through. But this is one of the weirder, rare versions of leftism and not taught much about. Anarchist communism was first formulated as such in the Italian section of the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International, often called the First International, as you see. That actually got started in London, had conferences in Geneva. Karl Marx was directly involved in it. The Second International was later, after Marx's time. I believe he was already dead by then, or very sick. Close to death. He had a liver disease, I believe it was. And then there was a Third International, and then later internationals. But you see, from Italy, it comes a lot of the major thinkers who weren't from Russia of anarchist communism. Kropotkin was particularly famous, and he was Russian, but there were a lot of Italian thinkers. It mentions Kropotkin again. There's also French influences. It talks about those here. I recommend the article on anarchist communism from Wikipedia. It's not horrendous. The Wikipedia ones are all a little bit shade things and will take stabs because anyone can edit it, and you get anti-communists who occasionally go and try and edit stuff in, but it's not terrible. And finally, to finish with that ideology and then move to democratic socialism, and I'm going to take as the approach here of moving from progressively less to more centralized socialist systems, so you can see, because often people talk about the other way around, and the less centralized ones become a side note, and then people claim socialism is authoritarian. It is no such thing. It is a varied view with more and less authoritarian groupings. And that's not to say authoritarian has become a slanderous word, but there are strong arguments to be made for needing a strong authority. So I'm not dissing either side. I'm just going in the opposite. This article is called What is Anarchist Communism? This is actually writings from 1929 by Alexander Berkman, Now and After the ABC of Anarchist Communism, published in New York City in 1929, back before McCarthyism, although the first Red Scare had already happened at this point. Starts with, you see various things. What do you want out of life? The wage system. This is from the Anarchist Library. A few things worth noting. He talks about the February Revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviki, known as the Communist Party, are in control of the government. The Revolution of October put them in power. That revolution was the most important in the world since the French Revolution. It was even greater on the latter because it went much deeper to the rock bottom of society. But then the anarchists here are arguing that it altered nothing. It was a political revolution, secured political rights and liberty. It did secure them. France is a democracy. Today, in the motto, liberty, brotherhood, equality is written even on every prison building, but did not free man from exploitation, oppression. And that, after all, was needed most. And then a lot of these anarchist writings I find tend to meander. The interesting things here, or at least I found interesting looking this a bit, is talking about non-communist anarchists, because this highlights this difference here. Before we proceed, let me make a short explanation. I owe it to those anarchists who are not communists, because you should know that not all anarchists are communists. Not all of them believe that communism, social ownership and sharing according to need, would be the best and justest economic arrangement. I have first explained to you communist anarchism because it is, in my estimation, the most desirous and practical form. And this is the author saying this. The communist anarchists held that only under communist conditions could anarchy prosper and equal liberty, justice, and well-being be assured to everyone without discrimination. But there are anarchists who do not believe in communism. They can generally be classified as individualists and mutualists. Anarchists believe in this fundamental position: the government means injustice and oppression. That is invasive, enslaving, and greatest hindrance to man's development and growth. They disagree mostly on the following points. First, the manner in which anarchy will come about. The communist anarchists say that only social revolution can abolish government and establish anarchy, while individualists and mutualists do not believe in revolution. They think present society will gradually develop. And this, out of the government into a non-governmental condition. This goes right into enough of that article. What I was talking about, the distinction between utopian and so-called scientific or Marxist socialists. That you find this same branching that occurs in both groups. Within anarchists, the anarcho-communists believe revolution be necessary in order to establish an anarchist state. Within socialists, you have the utopian socialists, which believe that there will be a gradual evolution of socialism out of the present capitalist society and no revolution is needed. And the Marxist or scientific socialism, who believe that either revolution or a concerted effort to win elections are necessary. The election thing may be surprising, and this is where you get the branching between Marxist-Leninists and other Marxists, because Marx himself said that he believed, and maybe I should have pulled up this article. It's from a writing he did to the First International, or the International Working Men's Association. He was very clear, and let's just check the time. It's been going 12 minutes. Not as long as I thought. He was very clear that in what he called advanced democracies, such as the United States and United Kingdom, it would be possible for socialists to win elections and establish socialism that way. I think he would, if you're alive today, you would say the U.S. has become virulently anti-communist, and that's no longer possible. But at the same time, certain other European countries that were not democracies at the time, such as France most notably, where the French Republic was not really a republic back then. It was a monarchy with, I believe it was Napoleon II or something, literally ruling. It was somewhere between a true absolute monarchy and Bismarckian style republic. Bismarck being the guy who united the little German states. It was not, what would you call that, Prussian Republic? Anyways, that style of government, if any of you have ever played the game Victoria 2, they literally call it, that style of government, Prussian democracy or something. It's different than, say, the so-called Queen's democracy of the UK, or the more pure republics that would later come into being, and everywhere from the United States eventually evolving to what could be truly called a republic, especially after the Civil War, with changes occurred then. Marx was, by the way, a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln. He actually wrote back and forth with him a little bit around the time of the U.S. Civil War, expressing his support for the North in opposition to the Confederacy, because slavery is considered the most vile form of labor oppression by Marx. So he was based on that. His views were obviously correct. We can say in hindsight the Confederacy was in the wrong. Unless I'm getting some neo-Confederates who are watching this video, I think most people would agree. But Marxists and in general non-idealistic socialists can be divided between democratic socialists, who emphasize the elections more, and Marxist-Leninists, who came to emphasize the necessity of revolution. Note that not all democratic socialists are always against revolution, but they believe elections should at least be the primary path pursued in places where elections exist. you'll find many democratic socialist ideologies that will say, for instance, revolution is okay in something, an absolute monarchy like, say, Saudi Arabia, where there are no free elections, that people should have the right to just revolt and establish socialism that way in such a system. So, because you obviously can't win elections if there are no elections. And if elections are being consistently cheated on, if there's rigging, if there's some of the nonsense that's occurred in Latin American so-called republics where ballot boxes have been stuffed in the past. Note that does not include Venezuela today, where they actually have one of the most insane election systems in the world in terms of the number of checks to make sure that there's no cheating occurring. But that did occur before the socialists started winning elections. It was actually the move to free and fair elections that allowed them to win. It's ironic how the history has been turned on its head this way, with now claiming that the socialists there must be cheating on elections, when actually it was the previous government that did that. But it stuck a little more because of the past history of cheating. There were history of elections being cheated in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. I don't think it's surprising to say there are many places that call themselves democracies or republics that aren't. South Korea's military dictatorship used to call itself a republic. It wasn't a republic in any real sense of the word until the 1980s, when the military dictatorship was peacefully overthrown and replaced with a republic in South Korea. It was kind of a peaceful revolution / forced constitutional reform movement that occurred, and actually the United States opposed that and called the people who wanted to establish a republic communists, even though most of them had nothing to do with communism, as just a slur and a way to try and maintain the authoritarian government. Now, moving to a more centralized version, as I said, we now come to democratic socialism. Democratic Socialism is About Democracy by Sean Guide. This is an article in Jacobin, which is a prominent democratic socialist magazine. They also have some Marxist-Leninists on their staff occasionally, or who write in. It is a leftist magazine, and that you all find social democrats occasionally writing it too, like Bernie Sanders type people, which democratic socialism and social democracy, not the same thing, even though the words sound extremely similar. It's because they used to be the same movement, and they diverged around the 20s, 30s, with the democratic socialists being the ones who you might say were more hardcore or dedicated to establishing socialism and believed that capitalism would destroy itself, and social democrats believing that a transition to socialism wasn't strictly necessary, or in some cases some believing it wasn't even desirable, and you could tame capitalism with very high taxes on the rich, as if that wouldn't later be rolled back by the rich, which is what history has shown has occurred in social democracies, with countries that used to be solely socially democratic having the rich gather their forces and roll back taxes and roll back welfare systems and such. There are a lot of ways to talk about democratic socialism. Some focus on fairness and equality. Others stress the need to fix the irrationalities of capitalism. So others speak of converting hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness. The democratic socialist de jure, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, recently gave her own definition on Stephen Colbert's show. Most people actually consider her a social democrat, but all right. I believe in a modern, moral, and wealthy society. No person in America should be too poor to live. So what that means in healthcare, what that means is healthcare is a human right. It means every child, no matter where you're born, should have access to college or trade school education if they so choose it. And I think no person should be homeless if we can have public structure and policies to allow for people to have homes and food and lead a dignified life. Not bad at all, but here's what I'd emphasize. Democratic socialism at its core is about deepening democracy where it exists and introducing democracy where it is absent. And namely, and it goes on to talk about this, this may sound fairly innocuous, who isn't democracy these days, but democratic socialists have something far more reaching in the mind. It's not, democracy is to them not simply an amalgamation of procedures, uncontroversial sets of norms and rules. It is the radical idea that ordinary people can rule themselves. And it goes on to talk about the key thing here, and what it comes down to is workplace democracy. It's not real democracy if you go to the workplace and that's a dictatorship of your boss from 9 to 5 or whatever hours you're working. I've worked a lot of night shifts over the years, so I'm not just saying that because those are the shifts I've worked. Democratic socialism emphasizes that you have to abolish capitalist enterprises and nationalize or turn to workers' cooperatives industries. Where it differs from Marxist-Leninism is the means to achieve such a society. It talks about socialist organized militant labor movements replace workplace despotism at the rudiments of democratic rights. Ford Motor Company, to take just one example, employed spies and goons to keep workers in line. It got much worse than that. There were use of Pinkerton detectives at some companies in the 1800s to murder strikers. Bayard Rustin, the socialist civil rights leader, contributed essential tactical know-how to bring down a racial caste system that smothered American democracy. Socialist feminists ripped down the walls between public and the private and asserted the need to place romantic partners on equal footing. Despite significant advances with many of the despotisms early socialists abhorred, the American workplace is one of the most glaring examples. The place where people spend the bulk of their adult lives. It's also a place where workers relinquish the most basic of democratic freedoms. Bosses can fire their supporters for nearly any reason. They can tell workers what to say and what not to say. They can decide whether to keep the work site where it is or move it abroad. They alone determine how to spend the company's profits and invest the resources the enterprise has generated. Democracy says people should have equal control over decisions that affects their lives. Capitalism laughs in its face. And then it goes on to talk about politics, business interests, how business interests really control the economy and political spheres at the same time. It gives an example of Sweden, where organized labor became powerful, but because they only went with social democracy, and the long-run business leaders were able to claw back a lot of their gains. Sweden did at one point after World War II get the point where they actually were trying to reform into socialism by slowly nationalizing all the corporations in the country. This led to CIA-funded propaganda saying they were willingly going behind the Iron Curtain, such nonsense. They continued with this, though. Despite this opposition, though, the right-wing propaganda was making real headway until the Soviet Union collapsed, or started to collapse in 1989, at which point they abandoned the plan, because if there was going to be no Soviet Union to possibly protect them against U.S. interference, and they'd probably been hoping to play off the U.S. and the Soviet Union against each other to maintain their independence. They weren't going to be under U.S. sphere of influence anymore as a socialist country. Then they decided correctly that it was a suicidal idea to pursue that would have just gotten Sweden bombed by the U.S. at some point. And then a note here, whether it's kings or patriarchs, capitalists or cops, the threat of a shift towards greater equality of power can prompt a ferocious counterattack. But to retreat in the face of elite opposition is to accept a social order strewn with master-servant relationships. A better world, a more democratic world, is possible. Democratic socialism, in the democratic socialists' own words there. All right. Anarchist communism, anarcho-communism. And now, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy here does talk about only gives one quote from one, and so maybe not the best. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. Marxist-Leninists do reject the idea that we live under democracies when we live in societies claim to be, because almost all the political power is actually held by the rich. You can see this very prominently in things like lobbying and politicians being bought and sold in the U.S. these days. But that was somewhat more far-sighted of a statement when Lenin said it. He correctly predicted, and you can read his other writings, many of the trends that were going to happen in capitalist countries. Indeed, Marxist theory in general predicts these trends, and did so over 150 years ago, predicted exactly where we're going to end up today for the most part. It may be that Marxists have failed to triumph over capitalism and replace it, but they have accurately predicted the ways capitalism would degenerate. But the Marxist-Leninists believe that if people try and win elections, that the rich, the bourgeois, will never accept the outcome of an election that would establish socialism or abolish capitalism, and they would just engage in reactionary violence, and so the only thing they do is go straight to revolution. That is what they believe. They combine this with the idea of a vanguard party. Let's see if I can get you guys a brief description of this. Vanguardism from Wikipedia. Vanguardist and Leninist struggle is a strategy. Vanguardism is a strategy where the most class-conscious members of the working class, known as the revolutionary vanguard, lead institutions to advance communist goals. The vanguard works to engage the working class in revolutionary politics and to strengthen proletarian political power against the bourgeois. This theory serves as the underpinning of the leading role of the Communist Party, usually enshrined in the Constitution after communists seized power of the state. There's people who are just trying to attack these articles. I don't know if it's actually biased or not. It talks about the difference between Trotskyism, Stalin's ideas. But yes, as I said, vanguard. They believe in a revolutionary vanguard, the Marxist-Leninists. This is something personally I disagree with them about, not because it's not an effective strategy when you're first trying to grow a revolutionary movement or grow support for winning elections, but what happens after? Too often the vanguard won't willingly relinquish their privileged position, even as more and more of society becomes socialist, with the workers being educated to socialism and being perfectly capable of displacing the vanguard. You've created a hierarchy that can become very dangerous, as it did become dangerous in the Soviet Union, to principles of democratic participation. I think I've explained before, the Soviet Union did have democratic participation. It did have a democratic structure to its society with mass meetings that would sometimes have dozens of candidates for an office. Someone would be selected. Then they would go on to the election. There'd be a single candidate on the ballot, but that doesn't mean it wasn't competitive elections, because remember, the mass meetings selected these people. That was a simple yes-no vote. If someone was voted no, which did happen in the general election, that meant, for whatever reason, maybe low participation in the mass meeting, maybe a scandal came out, maybe people just changed their mind. They decided they didn't like the person that was selected at the mass meeting, and there would be a recall of that candidate, and there would be another mass meeting to select another candidate. The problem is, of course, that the Communist Party, which was not everyone, it wasn't anyone who believes in communism. The Communist Party was the vanguard. Remember, I said the group of the most committed socialists with the greatest theoretical knowledge, the revolutionary vanguard, that continued even after the revolution occurred. And very often they would endorse particular candidates, and it became, when you have a mass meeting, you have 8, 9, a dozen people running. It became very easy for whoever was endorsed by the party to just very easily win, because it would give them an edge. And when you have 12 people running for an office, who really knows who they are? Even in our system that's inundated with corporate money, which buys ads, which means you always hear whose people are supposed to are. Most people don't really know who local candidates are. Now imagine a system without the corporate money, without all that political advertising, and then the one party that's allowed to exist because opposition parties are banned, endorses someone, that person would often win elections. Which, as I said, they were competitive at the level of the mass meetings, but it was problematic, and it was most problematic probably for the continued existence of the vanguard and the banning of opposition parties, which, even if you wanted to ban capitalist parties, there are different socialist sub-ideologies. You could have allowed an anarchist party, you could have allowed a Trotskyist party. You can see how there can be diversity within the left that could have been represented as different political parties that competed within, say, the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Leninism believes in what may sometimes be summarized as diversity of debate, unity of action. And that people are allowed to freely debate, but then when a decision is reached, everyone must cooperate on it. But this unfortunately becomes to the degree that opposition parties aren't allowed to exist to go around criticizing the decision that was reached through democratic debate. And decisions could have been made 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they're no longer what the people wish for anymore, but there's no opposition party to question previous decisions. You can see how this become problematic, but it was not intentionally, a new elite who wants to steal the power. It's just a system that started off with the best intentions, and because of the dangers of the vanguard party and only having a single party allowed, became somewhat less idealistic and democratic than had been originally planned. But despite such differences, all socialists agree on, above all, one thing: the socialized or public control of the means of production. There can be state ownership, where industries are nationalized. Critical to note that for this to actually be socialism, it's considered that the state must be under democratic control. So people, whether through this mass meeting kind of system or more conventional multi-party democracy, people must select the government officials select the managers for the nationalized companies, and thus nationalized companies are by way of the government under the control of the workers. Or there is a more decentralized socialism, trade unions and workers' cooperatives and communes directing the economy. Now, this existed even within the Soviet Union, especially in the later era with Gorbachev trying to grow out workers' cooperatives. Unfortunately, by the time Gorbachev came around, there were many people who had lost their faith in socialism in the Soviet Union. There are many individuals within his own administration who were CIA plants, who were secretly anti-socialist because they didn't have opposition parties. They existed where they might have affiliated with and outed themselves as such, which is one of the other dangers of only having one party. People will hide their views if they don't agree with that party, but still go into politics. It would have been better if people were openly labeled as capitalists because they were part of a capitalist opposition party. Then maybe Gorbachev's government wouldn't have been filled with so many of these people who would have illegally disbanded the Soviet Union. It was illegally disbanded and led to, whatever you think of the Soviet Union, immense suffering in the decade after, with death rates reaching levels on par with third world in some cases. Things like HIV exploding, deaths due to homelessness, which was unheard of in the Soviet Union because everyone was guaranteed free housing. Suddenly, children dying in the streets in the winter cold, drug addiction taking off. This happened in Ukraine, Poland, all over the former communist countries. Things went very poorly. And it was illegal. It was in violation of the Soviet Union's own laws. It was a violation of the will of the people. A referendum was held, and the vast majority of people within the Soviet Union and within Ukraine and all these other countries, they wanted the Soviet Union to continue. In fact, what actually did happen is Yeltsin withdrew Russia from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was made up of 14 republics, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, one of which was Russia, another of which was Ukraine, another of which was Kazakhstan. These are recognizable because they're, for the most part, these republics became independent countries afterwards. And most notably, the Republic of Ukraine strongly voted to maintain the Soviet Union. They wanted to move towards a more decentralized approach, with Ukraine having more autonomy within it, but they actually hammered out an agreement with many of the minor Soviet republics to maintain the Soviet Union. And then Yeltsin, not liking this system, I think preferring that if Russia was fully independent, it could exploit countries like Ukraine as an independent country, whereas if they were still in the Soviet Union with a little more autonomy, Russia would not be free to do this because there would be legal rights and protections. Yeltsin withdrew Russia from the Soviet Union, effectively killing it. This was after an agreement had already been reached to maintain the Soviet Union with legal reforms, and after public referendums had been held that showed that the majority of people supported continuing the system. They wanted the system to continue, but they wanted reforms, is what polls, elections, referendums, they all showed. People wanted reforms. They thought there were major problems with the Soviet Union, but they didn't want it to end. So it was illegal the way it was dissolved. Now, whether it's the workers' cooperatives, trade unions, and communes, which anarchists much more heavily emphasize, and democratic socialists lean more towards, especially democratic socialists who are also market socialists, or state ownership and planning. All socialists believe in social or public control of the means of production. Social control is the workers control the place they work, and public control is society does, not just the workers, but the whole community. Think of a small town with 2,000 people and 200 people working in a factory there. If only the 200 people in the factory control a factory, that's social control. If the whole 2,000 all have a say, not necessarily equal say, but the whole community has a say in how that factory is run, that's public control. It may lead to, for instance, more consideration for air pollution standards than if it's just the 200 workers who may be willing to allow a little more air pollution in exchange for higher wages for themselves, because bring down the cost of production. But these both differ from capitalist control, where say you have 12 people on a board of directors or less, let's say 2 co-owners for just one factory. You have a pair of capitalist owners who own the factory, and those 2 people make all the decisions, and they're much more willing to emphasize things like pollution and to pay the workers very low wages and pocket all the profits themselves than if it was that 200. But there's still different levels. All socialists agree, though, that this capitalist system of ownership needs to go. If you don't believe in that, you're not a socialist. You're a social democrat, most likely. And they all agree in the belief in an eventual communist utopia. Whether it's the utopian socialists who believe society will evolve that way, no revolution is necessary, the anarcho-communists who believe in a revolution but want to move straight to a society which might be called this communist utopia, or Marxist-Leninists who want a revolution and want to slowly evolve society this way, or democratic socialists in election. Those who are not anarchists tend to believe in a transitional phase known as socialism as opposed to communism. So communist parties believe in socialism. Their system that created socialism. They may have been labeled communists to distinguish them from democratic socialists or anarcho-socialists, also known as anarcho-communists, but they are fundamentally, and in all cases, people who believe in a socialist transitional stage. This transitional stage may have a powerful and centralized government, as, say, the Soviet Union did, where a small oligarchy at the top of people who were party insiders. Usually they were actually highly dedicated to the principles of socialism. They weren't just corrupt, as often been claimed. More of the corruption actually fell in the middle ranks, but you had essentially a group of about 12 people at the top of the Soviet Union who made most of the decisions. It wasn't like, falsely it'll get called dictatorship or despotism, and that's a lie, even though you'll find if you Google it, tons of people claim that. Many of these people claiming it, or some websites actually, are actually right-wing think tanks or organizations directly funded by the CIA or by large, what would I call it, foundations that fund propaganda, which are ultimately funded by billionaires. These foundations, but the truth of the matter is it was not a dictatorship, it was an oligarchy. Oligarchy is still not democracy, but it was not one person ruling, it was a council at the top of the Soviet Union, which, for instance, Stalin sat, but he was very frequently overruled by the other people in the council. A dictator can just say, I'm doing this, I don't care what you guys think. An oligarchical council, there may be a chief of the council, and they may hold lesser, greater degrees of power. For instance, Stalin held more power than did Khrushchev, and Khrushchev thought Stalin was too powerful, and there was the process of de-Stalinization and tearing down portraits and statues of Stalin in some cases, and this nearly caused a revolution in Georgia, which was the Soviet Republic in which Stalin was born. He was not a Russian, he was a Russian-Georgian, half each group. He was mixed race, I guess you could say. But not races and mixed ethnicity, and this whole concept of race is a relic of old, bad styles of thinking that didn't emerge till the Middle Ages and colonialism anyhow. So, what different levels of control, but not really the decentralized society that both communists and anarchists believe lies at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. Those who believe in a transitional state believe that you need to do things like crush capitalism, protect against capitalist subversion, develop the economy, develop education among the workers and knowledge of socialism, because people don't instantly know socialist theory. When you get rid of capital society, it takes a generation or two for people to learn the theory and engage with it. Most people have other things going on in their lives, like working, raising a family. So you work it into people's lives bit by bit. When their parents and their grandparents have all been inundated in this theory, they should be more knowledgeable than 5 years after a revolution. So there are reasons they believe in this. They believe, powerful state and surveillance intelligence agencies may be necessary to deal with, the CIA trying to overthrow every socialist revolution that's ever occurred, with create a counter-revolution, a coup, which is not inaccurate. That has happened again and again throughout history. The danger, of course, is that in trying to protect something precious, you destroy the thing that you're trying to protect, because you end up with too much centralization of power. The NKVD, for instance, committed horrible abuses, and was actually disbanded and reformed into the KGB in an attempt to end that, but the KGB continued to do many of the same things the NKVD had done. So it was a failed attempt at reform, or partially successful, because the KGB was less prone to do things like torture or kill people without trial than the NKVD had been. Which, for those who know anything about the KGB, should tell you something about how bad the NKVD was before them. It was even worse. Now, the Soviet Union never claimed to be communism, or not frequently. There were one or two examples of individuals claim this, and people would tend to kind of scoff at it, even with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was not communism, it was socialism. It was that transitional stage. And as I said, anarchists believe in a direct transition. They believe if you go for this transitional stage, you'll get stuck there, it'll devolve into so-called state capitalism. You'll hear anarchists and sometimes Trotskyists throw that term around as an insult very often. They'll use it to say that they don't think China is socialist right now, which it absolutely fits the definition of this transitional stage. It may be less far along than the Soviet Union ever was towards socialism, and it may have actually done some backsliding at certain points, but it would still be considered this transitional stage with increasing levels of nationalization of businesses, for instance, and private ownership is never abolished overnight. In fact, it persisted in the Soviet Union for quite some time. It was always a gradual process of nationalization. So the fact that a lot of industry in China is capitalist and that these are actually outgrowing the state enterprises, so the proportion goes up, not because companies are being privatized, but because the private enterprises with foreign investment are growing due to foreign investment, because foreign capital is not investing in the state enterprises, only in the private ones in the special economic zones. They outgrow the state companies, and so this may lead to changes in proportions. So there is a process of every now and then one of these private enterprises gets nationalized in China. So this can't continue forever. And particularly, there's always so much that the SEZ enterprises can grow before they stop growing, and then the proportion of nationalized control will just steadily increase over time if things continue. Now, we come to the principle of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's often intentionally misrepresented by reactionaries and anti-communists as a dictatorship in the sense of a tyranny. It's important to know, though Marx spoke English, it wasn't his first language. German was. He lived in London. He spoke English pretty well. I've read stuff he wrote a little bit, especially the First International, some of his writings them. In English, he wrote these things. You can also see the letters he wrote to Abraham Lincoln. It's very clear that he spoke English, but there were occasions where it not being his first language would cause issues. He wasn't a super polylingual, polyglot person who could speak any language fluently, like Engels was actually. Engels spoke something like 14 languages fluently. Marx spoke German, and he spoke English very well. But there's definitely, and I speak quite a lot of German, have studied it in school some, taken some time to practice it. I'm very rusty at this point, but there's definitely a language thing here going on. The dictatorship of the proletariat. In German, the phrase has a somewhat different meaning in translation, and you can see it, I not even necessarily the phrase is used, but the phrase that it's clear Marx is basing on would refer more to a dictatorship being not a autocratic society, but what section, who is in charge. You could think of it more accurately as the leadership of. If you just replace the word dictatorship with leadership, you have the concept Marx was trying to express almost exactly. He believed in creating a leadership of the proletariat, that is, a leadership of the workers, to replace proletariat with the English word that's more commonly used. So he wanted to switch from a leadership of capital, that is, where those who own the stocks, the bonds, the banks control society, the billionaire class, to leadership by the workers, the masses of people. He emphasized workers excessively because he actually had some rather terrible views about, say, the disabled, which I saying this as someone who's myself disabled thanks to long COVID. And he wrote them about them being what he called the lumpen reactionary. He was too influenced by sometimes a group of disabled people siding with the reactionaries in France and Germany and thinking that would always occur. But so he emphasized the workers, but what he meant is ordinary people. Like if you're talking America, it would mean changing from a society led by the rich to a society led by ordinary Americans, where the presidents aren't from wealthy backgrounds, the senators aren't friends with millionaires. These are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would be considered a person like this because she was worked at a bar. You have bar workers, restaurant owners, people who drove plow trucks, people who worked in customer service. You would have ordinary people leading society, and not all the power residing with billionaires. That's what one common misconception. But the anarchists even will sometimes participate in misusing this phrase because they have been very hostile to other groups of socialists throughout history, especially to the Soviet Union. And this is not an accident either. The CIA very early on found that it was easy to infiltrate anarchist groups because they don't have a centralized command structure or any way that they can easily monitor each other for infiltration. And so the CIA, the FBI, slid a lot of infiltrators into anarchist groups and took them over and used them to spread propaganda to try and undermine leftism. This was intentional. This was not an accident. This was something that was planned and funded and weaponized, and it was a strategy. And there are declassified documents you can read that prove this now, thanks to Freedom of Information Act, although too many things get omitted from those documents. We do know, however, that some of the early leaders of the Democratic Socialist America, for instance, around the time of the Vietnam War, were, when they formed actually from pre-existing socialist organizations in the U.S., there was a fragmentation that occurred. And one of the early leaders of the DSA was actually a CIA plant, for instance. So they slid into anarchist and into democratic socialist groups, the more decentralized ones. However, despite this, as I said, dictatorship or proletariat simply refers to the leadership. Now, last but not least, I have some notes here about how communists often tend to erase democratic socialist movement or lump them in with social democrats. They're discrete ideologies. Democratic socialists do cover, when I say they do extend across multiple divisions. You find idealistic socialists, branches of the Demsos, who are those who think society will just evolve with elections playing a part into socialism, and there won't even be like a major socialist party will have to win a hard-fought election and abolish certain forms of private ownership. They'll somehow just happen over time. There's no historical evidence that's ever supported that theory, but that although you'll you can read writers who try and claim there is. I would challenge anyone to find evidence that has actually been the trend of history. You will find those who are Marxists, or may not call themselves Marxists, but they tend to fall more in this line of what Marx called scientific socialism, because this was actually a branch, a division that was starting to form with or without Marx. Great emphasis there on either peaceful revolutions or elections that you need to, or violent revolutions if it's like against a regressive monarchy like the Saudi Arabian regime, the Iranian theocracy. You get the idea. It's not completely opposed to revolution, but you have the scientific and idealistic democratic socialists, and you have those who will work with the communists and those who will keep them at arm's length and spew propaganda against them. That's why it's very, very inaccurate to say dem social this or dem social that. It's one of the most varied groups, for better or worse. But if you talk about a specific sub-branch, if you say not democratic socialists, but the idealistic democratic socialists, the scientific Marxist ones, then you can start to make meaningful statements. Some consider themselves to be Marxists. As I said, Marx himself talked about elections in the First International, which was, by the way, 8 million people. 8 million people. Let me repeat that myself. Around the time of the U.S. Civil War. Most of them around London, Geneva. This was before the split, where the anarchists broke off from the rest of the socialists from within this organization, because this was very much a catch-all, all leftists, and then the anarchists broke off, and then later you would see divisions between democratic socialists and social democrats, between democratic socialists, Marxist-Leninists. You would see, by the time of the Third International, you would see the Trotskyites break off and try to form the Fourth International, which was shorter lived but did exist for a while. Actually, shorter lived. It may have lasted almost the same number of years or more. It was later in time though, so there was a fragmentation process. It's these different groups that had differences in ideology were either broken apart by subversion, groups who would intentionally try and split them from each other to weaken leftism, or just over agreements because they decided their differences are reconcilable. And one of the focal points of this was over the Soviet Union and whether to support it, or whether to support the U.S. in its Cold War efforts to overthrow that, which I think anyone who was not in bad faith, who held those views back then and was still around today, would realize that the end of the Soviet Union allowed the U.S. to run roughshod over the world and has led to a very dangerous capitalist dystopia where now climate change is in danger of wiping out humanity, and capitalism is in danger of becoming so established it's impossible to ever get rid of, with things like AI and drones, meaning that it would be possible for the governments to just gun down tens, hundreds of millions of people if they get out and strike after strikes have been outlawed, or they try and march when protests have been made illegal, or they try revolution, violent or peaceful. The advent of AI and drones and modern surveillance means that we may end up in a permanent state of this dystopia where it's impossible to ever get rid of. So, on the other hand, society is becoming worse and worse for most people. So there are those known as accelerationists who would say these increasing contradictions within capitalism are going to lead to its demise. Only time will tell if they're correct or not. Capitalism is both becoming worse for people to live under, and at the same time, it is increasing its control over society and developing its apparatuses of oppression to the point where it might not matter what most people think ever again. We're a tiny sliver of, if you've ever seen, I think it's the movie Elysium, where the rich live in like a space station. They're way more privileged than anyone else in mass slums. That's the kind of world we might be headed towards. It won't matter if most people oppose them, because what are you going to do? There's limits to human agency and how much you can overcome systems designed to prevent your agency. Anyways, this video, an hour, that's a long time to talk. It's a long time to go through a limited subset of readings and then come back to this outline. Perhaps I should have spent more time on those readings or talked less. And I may do new videos that are either shorter or go more detail into some of these sub-ideologies. But this is my video, What is Leftism? I hope you all enjoyed. I wish you the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. May you always find a guiding star to lead you home.